Hello and welcome to Economy and Markets TV, the show that takes you around the world of economic and financial news. I'm your host, Dave Okenquist, Senior Research Analyst here at Dent. It's time to recap the news of the week, which means it is time to bring on my partner, Mr. Rodney Johnson. Rodney, welcome.
Thank you.
Rodney is, of course, the Senior Editor and Co-Founder of Dent Research. Rodney and I highlight the most important news items of the week. I give Rodney 2 minutes to go through his spiel, and if he goes over, he will get this sound and it's time to move on. We all want to move on with our day and not to hear a guy bloviating, right, Rodney?
I don't know. Could be interesting, but we'll stick to the 2 minutes.
We'll see. All right, let's get into our first item, which is in housing. New home sales were up 6.7% for the month, 10% for the year, and the U.S. National Home Price Index is up 6.6% for the year, though prices were up just 0.2% below expectations. Mm-hmm. Rodney, what do you make of this jump in sales, and are we getting maybe a possible slowdown in prices?
It's kind of interesting because you look at new home sales up 10% for the year over this time last year. That's a pretty good move. New home sales are only about 10% of the market. Okay. The 800-pound gorilla remains existing home sales, which we saw last week. We're actually down a little bit over the past year. And so the bulk of the market is not growing. But prices remain high. And so we've talked about this number for, 3 years now we've been talking about this, where prices keep marching higher, but you don't see incomes marching. So how long can it continue? This could be the plateau where we're kind of moving sideways before we start to get prices come down a little bit to increase affordability. New home sales, as you would expect, builders can build in areas where they see a lot of demand at the price point. So it makes sense that you would see builders able to kind of seek out those pockets. So a slowdown, yes, certainly in units based more on existing sales than new home sales. Haven't seen prices come in yet, but I expect it. We all expect it. We just don't know when.
But new home sales, that does drive employment, right? Even though it's not the bulk of the housing sales?
It can, and we have to distinguish between single-family units and multifamily units.
Okay.
When you're building new single-family units, the homes we live in, then you're putting a lot of people to work for each home versus building 30 units in an apartment or 100 units in an apartment. Doesn't put nearly the number of people to work for the units that you're building. And so we've seen single-family homes continue to come online, so it has been driving some employment. But employment in the sector remains much lower than it was before the financial crisis, and that's one of the things holding back new home building and construction is they just can't get enough qualified people to go back to those trades.
Yeah, interesting stuff there. Thanks for that explanation, Rodney. Let's move on to our next topic. Oil reached 3-year highs on inventory drops. Inventory fell nearly 10 million barrels, and now prices are hovering right around $80 a barrel. And I heard that with these Iran sanctions, there's some speculation that we can go over 90. Do you see that in our future, Rodney? Prices going over 90, maybe looking at 100?
It can, and let's kind of separate out what you can see in a short-term shock versus a long-term trend.
Okay.
Oil is a small market. We think of it as big because people talk about it all the time, but the dollars involved, the actual number of transactions and dollars involved are really small when you compare it to stocks, bonds, certainly to currency. And so when you have moves in that market that change supply or demand even a little bit, it can cause these weird jumps and changes. And so for Iran, they're producing, I think, around 3 million barrels of oil a day. Our sanctions were expected to bring that down by several 100,000 barrels, say, 3 to 500,000. Well, now the Trump administration has told people who buy Iranian oil, mostly the Indians, North Koreans you're not talking to as much, and the Chinese, hey, you need to stop buying this by November 4, or we're going to cut your financial institutions out of the network of U.S. dollars. That's a huge threat.
Yeah.
And so that's what's causing everybody to say, hey, wait a second, maybe there won't be, millions of barrels of Iranian oil. We're going to have to make that up. And do the other suppliers have enough capacity to bring that on? That's what's driving the short-term shock. It will work back out. I don't think we're going to be at 90 come, October or the first of the year. But could we stay in the 70s? You bet we could. No question about that.
Now, OPEC recently agreed to increase production, and we're going to see some of that at least trickle in. Just obviously it didn't happen instantaneously, but will that at least bring prices down in the short term? Or are we going to continue sort of staying around this plateau of the mid 70s up to 80 and then see what happens with Iran?
Right. With short-term spikes, possibly over 90, That's the question. Can Saudi Arabia produce enough oil to make up for Iran? And I don't think they can. Nobody thinks they can bring on another 2.5, 3 million barrels of oil a day. Can they move it from, almost 11 up to 12? They say they can. We'll have to see if they can do that. But it's still just 1.2 a day, whereas they would have to be able to produce 3 to make this happen and make people more comfortable.
Okay, great stuff, Rodney. Thank you for that. Moving on to our next topic, the Supreme Court strike down the requirement that for public workers that are covered by unions to pay union dues. This was a 5-4 decision. We try to stay clear of politics here, but Rodney, I understand that this decision could have some kind of economic impact and a topic that is, I don't want to call it near and dear to your heart, but something that you talk about a lot.
Well, it's public pensions.
Right.
And I go back to when unions were really first galvanized under Roosevelt in the 30s, and people were given the right to unionize in a big way. He was asked to allow public employees to unionize as well, and he declined. And he said, "Wait a second, that's a public service. You are a civil servant, and so it makes no sense for you to be unionized. Then you're fighting against the government entity, be it the federal government, cities, states, whatever it is." And so he said no. It was President Kennedy that actually signed the executive order allowing public employees to unionize. And that's where all the growth in unions has been really since the 70s. As private unions dropped, public unions increased. And it's a weird thing because you have people who can go down to City Hall and say, hey, if you don't give me the raise I want by this union contract, I'm going to get you voted out of office. Right. That's a really strange relationship. And so
the incentives there seem to be broken, at least one-sided in any event.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And who's voting? Who's on the other side? I mean, you and I are not down at City Hall saying, "Hey, don't vote to increase this wage for this union that's of city workers because my taxes are going to go up." We rely on the city officials to do that, but then they're threatened with their job if they're playing hardball. And so, strange situation, which has led to a lot of things like dramatically increased benefits in terms of pensions and other things over the years, which we're now at a very unsustainable level for many reasons. Some of them certainly not the fault of the workers, but we're going to have to come to some arrangement on how to dial that back. Mm-hmm. And so far, unions have not been of a mind to negotiate that. And so perhaps this will kind of break the impasse and give us a way forward on a lot of these public pensions that are looking to bankrupt cities and even states around the country.
Yeah. It's certainly this will ripple. This effect will ripple for a while. We'll see the full impact, in the coming months and years, right? And then we get news of Justice Kennedy retiring, so the court could be heading more into this direction. We could be seeing decisions that sort of bend more to this way. So it's exciting times, right, Rodney?
Well, what a great topic, right, to talk about for the next 7 months or 3 months or whatever it is when we're going to be dealing with this. I certainly think it's going to happen before the midterm election.
Right.
But there's no sense in us beating it up because everybody else is.
Yeah, exactly. All right, thank you for that. Let's move on. This is a find of yours, a little bit of humor. The Museum of London displays a chunk of the Fatberg.
Yep.
Rodney, what is the Fatberg?
Kind of a gross thing. It happened in New York, and of course it happened in London as well. And their sewers, they found a stoppage that was made up of things that were flushed under the city that is made up of fat and wipes and other things that don't disintegrate, don't dissolve. Yeah. And so it just creates this growing thing. And you have the clog in your arteries, well, a clog in the sewer. Well, Fatberg, as it was named in London when they were trying to get rid of this a couple of years ago, was over 800 feet long, weighed over 100 tons, and it took workers weeks and weeks working with jackhammers and drills trying to pull it out.
The pictures are pretty ghastly. It's disgusting.
It's really disgusting. And the fact that the Museum of London would put a piece of this on display is a bit of a head scratcher, but it worked, right? I mean, It drew a bunch of people. They were all interested in seeing a piece of this thing under glass. And so the Museum of London is considering making it permanent. But before they do, they're going to have to work on preserving it a bit because the darn thing is oozing and changing colors, which I just find disgusting. Yeah. I'm not sure I would pay admission to a museum just to see a piece of this. But hey, if it's drawing in people to the museum, then, good for them. It's working.
Yeah, I mean, who's interested in Monet anymore? What we really want to do is get down to the gutter, and that's how you're going to bring in people, right?
The new meaning of let's get, in the gutter, your mind's in the sewer.
Yeah, exactly. All right, thanks for Rodney. Thanks for having that, Rodney. It's always good to have a laugh. Looking ahead to next week, we of course have the 4th of July on Wednesday. Our offices will be closed. And then we have factory orders, car sales, minutes from the last Fed meeting, and U.S. employment. So it's actually going to be a busy week, and even though it's sandwiched with the 4th of July on Wednesday. Anything else you have your mind on, Rodney?
Now, the Fed minutes are going to be interesting. There was a note out this morning about, yesterday, the president of the Boston Fed is pretty adamant that we need at least 2 more rate hikes this year. He sees that a possible runaway in the U.S. economy is coming, and the Fed would have to dial it back very quickly, meaning raise rates very quickly to get ahead of it if we see the economy driving inflation. I don't see that, but it will be of note to see what the voting members of the Fed Open Market Committee were debating at the last meeting. And so we'll be reading the minutes of that Fed meeting very closely.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Rodney, that's all the time we have this week. I want to thank you for coming on each and every week, for providing your insight and your unique perspective. I'm sure everybody watching is enjoying it as well and appreciates it. And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week.